The original plans for Avengers Endgame. That's why Jack.
What if, in Avengers Endgame, Tony and Cap died together? Well, they almost did. In fact, at one point, all of the
I had to
original
restart
six
streaming
Avengers would
because
have
of
met their end. There also would have been
technical
no
difficulties.
portals, Nick Fury would
We
have
back.
died, the time heist wouldn't have gone
Nick
back
Fury
to
was
the year
gonna die?
2012,
Oh
Thor
my
would have fought
goodness.
a younger version of himself, Stark would have went to Asgard, and Thanos and Doctor Strange would have had a rematch. So let's dive in and find out why these changes
I didn't even see that.
happened, resulting in
Wait.
the movie we got, and also
first
take a
match
look at what
happened
could
in
have been
the
Endgame.
first movie?
Kevin Feige originally pitched a Toy Story 3 style ending, where all of the original Avengers would sacrifice themselves together. However, directors Joe and Anthony Russo pushed back against this idea,
There we go.
believing it was too extreme and that
Perfect.
audiences wouldn't be able to process such a massive loss. Instead, they opted for a more balanced approach, choosing specific characters to make sacrifices at key moments to allow for emotional catharsis while maintaining the film's momentum.
Catharsis?
The
Who know
Russos
what
at
that
one
word
point
means?
considered having Cap and Tony die together. However, producer Nate Moore suggested the idea of Steve reuniting with Peggy Carter, figuring that giving him a chance at personal happiness would be a more meaningful and unexpected resolution. Unlike Tony, whose arc
W.
revolved
Peggy.
around learning
We call her Weggy
self-sacrifice,
over here.
harkening all the way back to
Weggy
Cap's line
Carter.
in the first Avengers when he tells Stark,
Gotta
"You're
have
not
an
the guy who
Avengers
makes a
marathon, bro.
sacrifice play," Cap had always been willing to
Been
lay
so
down
long.
his life for the greater good. What he never allowed himself was a life of his own. By sending Steve back in time to be with Peggy, the film gave him closure in a way that honored his character without resorting to another tragic farewell. Plus,
Yeah.
the Russos felt it would be better to have varied outcomes for the characters, as it's less predictable and creates a richer ending. However, an earlier draft of the film saw Thanos traveling back in time to kill every Avenger in 2012, and dropping the decapitated head of past Captain America at the feet of present
I don't know if that form is correct.
Tony Stark's death
It's
was
okay.
originally conceived very differently. In the initial version of the scene, he never repeated his now iconic line, "I am Iron Man," which was a powerful callback to the first film. Thanos didn't say anything
That was the
either.
original
In this
scene? No
version,
way.
which was shot, Thanos simply put on the gauntlet, gave Stark a knowing look as if to say, "I've won," and snapped his fingers, only to realize in stunned disbelief that nothing happened. He then turned to Tony, who silently raised his hand and snapped instead. While beautifully shot and emotionally resonant,
Yeah, I don't know how
something
that
was missing.
scene would have been
Dramatic
without the I
resolution
am
for
Iron Man,
Thanos.
bro.
The Russos realized that Thanos' arc
That
in
would've been a
Endgame was
legendary
built around his
miss.
belief of inevitability. The idea that no matter how hard the Avengers tried, they could never truly defeat him. For the film's conclusion to have true
Then Thor cut his head off.
Thanos needed to verbalize this belief one last time by saying, "I am inevitable," which led the filmmakers to Tony's response, "And I am Iron Man." However, reshooting that scene was a challenge. Downey had already said his emotional goodbyes to the cast, and mentally and emotionally moved on from the role, assuming that last day on set was the last he'd ever play the character. However, Feige and the Russos convinced him that the line was necessary to the film's story. Adding to the poignancy, when he finally returned to shoot the new ending, it was on a stage directly across from where he had originally auditioned for Iron Man. His final moment as Tony Stark was filmed
that's
just a few hundred
nice,
feet
bro.
away from where his journey began, bringing his story full
That's
circle
nice.
in
I'm
the
not
most
gonna lie, that's
poetic way
fire.
possible. The writers also originally wrote a
Right
number of
across.
dying words for Tony, but Downey thought it would be much more powerful for Tony to shut up for once and die silently. His fellow Avengers also originally took a knee afterwards, but this was cut out of the final film, as was a scene where Tony
For
visits
what,
the
bruh?
Soul World after snapping his fingers to meet his grown-up daughter Morgan, which the Russos felt was confusing and disrupted the emotional weight of his death. At one point, Nick Fury would have died in a brutal confrontation with Thanos' Black Order. In a moment meant to mirror Agent
Black Order.
Coulson's death in the Avengers, Fury would have been stabbed from behind by Corvus Glaive. Had the scene been kept, Captain Marvel, where Fury plays a major role alongside Brie Larson's Carol Danvers, would have effectively served as a swan song. In fact, Fury's post-credit scene in Infinity War, where he pages Captain Marvel, was almost scrapped as well. The Russos
Dude.
revealed that they originally considered not including any post-credit scene at all, wanting audiences to sit with the full weight of the film's devastating ending. In
Bro,
the end, however, they
what
chose
a-
to feature
I'm so
Fury's
glad they
desperate
made
call
these
to
decisions,
Captain
bro.
Marvel,
What the
offering
heck?
fans a small glimmer of hope, and of course to tease the next movie. And speaking of the end of
There was
Infinity
no
War,
way
the
they was
heartbreaking
originally
scene where
planning to not
Hawkeye's
have none
family
of these, bro.
vanishes due to the snap was originally planned for the end of Infinity War. The idea was to show that Thanos' actions had consequences beyond the battlefield, reinforcing the full scope of his devastation. However, the filmmakers found that placing the scene there disrupted the placing of the climax. Instead, the Russos
True.
decided to move it to the opening of Endgame, as it immediately re-immersed the audience in the emotional weight of Infinity War's ending before continuing with the story. story. Natasha's sacrifice on Vormir was originally different too.
Did you just say Natasha?
Was interrupted
Natasha is crazy.
Showed up. As Clint
It's
formulates
Natasha.
a plan to fend them off, Natasha ignores him and sprints towards the edge
Natasha
of the cliff,
is
determined to
crazy.
sacrifice herself. As Natasha runs, Thanos' forces shoot her 3 times, but she clings to life just long enough to drag herself to the edge. When she looks back, she saves Clint before jumping off the cliff as Thanos himself approaches. From there, the scene played out as it did in the final film, with Clint being teleported to safety. However, this version of the scene lacked the emotional depth of the final cut. The attack from Thanos' forces distracted from the core of Natasha's sacrifice, cutting short the heartfelt exchange between her and Clint. And unlike the theatrical version,
Natasha.
Clint actively fought to stop her.
Did he actually just blow her? He just hit her with an explosive arrow?
Which of the two was going to die? Even Nebula's death.
I haven't seen Endgame in so long, bro.
Originally, she would have managed to intercept the Stark Gauntlet during the chaotic game of Keep Away in the final battle. Desperate to prove her worth to Thanos, she would have attempted to wield the gauntlet herself. A nod to the comics, where Nebula briefly takes control of the stones. However, she would have quickly discovered that she wasn't powerful enough to survive using them, leading to her death. This version would have further emphasized her tragic desperation for her father's approval, but ultimately, the filmmakers chose a more direct confrontation between the two versions of Nebula, reinforcing good Nebula's growth by having her kill her doppelganger when she aims her gun at Gamora. The time heist originally played out very differently in early drafts. Instead of revisiting the events of the Avengers, the team initially planned to send Tony to Asgard, where he would have worn a stealth suit to infiltrate Odin's vault to retrieve the Ether and Tesseract. Once inside, he would have faced off against Heimdall.
That might have been fire too,
would
though.
have extended scenes with Jane Foster, including a very
nope, never mind. I'll take it back. Don't nobody want to see Jane.
Allow him to remove the Ether from her body.
However, what is Rocket on?
The writers had Thor face off against his past self on Asgard. While this would have highlighted his growth over the last decade, the Russos felt it made the time heist overly complex. Instead, they chose to move the fighting himself concept over to Captain America, deciding that Thor's arc was better served.
Yeah, Thor would have got whooped. I'm not gonna lie. That would have been Thor against almost prime Thor.
Rather than a physical confrontation with his past self. Morag was also envisioned.
And he wasn't even like goofy Thor either, like Love and Thunder Thor. That was
logistically complex and
fat
didn't allow
Thor.
Thanos and his daughters to track the heroes at the right moment. At one point, the Tesseract was retrieved from the Triskelion, with a character then driving to Doctor Strange's house, a sequence the writers later admitted sounded absurd when spoken out loud. Initially, they avoided returning to the Avengers because it felt like they were pandering, but Joe Russo eventually pushed for it, realizing that sometimes the best choice is the one that makes the most narrative sense. The time suits were originally different too, and
sometimes the best choice is a choice.
Allowed them to travel into space, which would have looked like a bubble around everyone's heads. But after seeing the test footage, the Russos thought it looked awful, so they gave everyone Ant-Man-inspired helmets, while the breather mesh became the visor. Everyone returning from the snap was almost handled very differently.
Looked like bubblegum wrap all over their face.
Reappeared at the compound, but since it was well before Thanos showed up, they would have cut to everyone eating pizza to kill time, as a subtle nod to the Avengers eating shawarma in the first movie. Thor almost had a training montage to shed his weight before the final battle, showing him physically prepared to face Thanos once again. However, this was ultimately scrapped. Another version didn't even have the snapped Avengers arriving through the portals.
Oh, nah, that's a crime.
Cap, and everybody would have been collected behind him. When the portals were introduced, it was originally Peter Parker who would have returned from the snap first, but this was restructured to build on itself instead, making the moment even more impactful. Thanos and Doctor Strange were originally set for a rematch during the final battle, with Strange blasting Thanos' consciousness into the mindscape and presenting him with all his various crimes before being brought before the Living Tribunal, an all-powerful cosmic entity who would judge him guilty. While this sequence would have been a visually stunning callback to Doctor Strange, it was ultimately cut to keep the final battle on the battlefield. Thor joining the Guardians at the end of the film wasn't originally planned. It was a last-minute decision made during editing, sparking fan speculation that Guardians 3 might cheekily be titled as Guardians of the Galaxy. This completely blindsided James Gunn.
That was the post-credit scene?
And signed on to direct Guardians of the Galaxy 3. And
peak movie, by the way. Peak trilogy.
In his story, which was already written. Luckily, Thor: Love and Thunder quickly resolved the plotline,
we don't speak on Love and Thunder.
Gunn from having to incorporate Thor into his film. While Avengers Endgame could have taken many different directions, the final version we got was a carefully crafted balance of nostalgia, emotional payoffs, and character-driven storytelling. From alternate deaths to drastically different time heist plans, these changes highlight just how much the film evolved during development. In the end, Endgame wasn't just about closing a chapter, it was about honoring the journey that led there, ensuring each hero got the send-off that felt true to their story.
That's valid.
Thanks for watching, everybody, and don't forget to like.
Alright, shout out Bullets and Blockbusters.